For thousands of years, this face has sat silent.
Before you laugh, sit down and give me 11 seconds. 17 colossal stone heads pulled out of the swamps of southern Mexico. Some weighing up to 50 tons, carved between 1500 BC and 400 BC, with full lips, wide noses, and tight corn-rolled braids that look like they walked off a porch in Atlanta. Those heads are called the Olmec Heads. The Olmecs built the first major civilization in the Americas almost 3,000 years before Columbus claimed to discover anything. And every time a scholar suggests those faces might be African, the academic world rushes in to change the subject. Stay with me, because the stones are still here, the dates are real, and the cover-up is loud enough to hear if you stop. Start with what the dirt actually gave up. The first Olmec head was unearthed in 1862 by a farmer in Tres Zapotes, Mexico. A man named Jose Mara Melgar y Serrano wrote about it that year and said plainly that the face had Ethiopian features. He didn't hedge. He looked at the stone and said, "This looks African." The academic establishment immediately got nervous because in 1862, admitting Africans crossed an ocean before Columbus would have shattered the entire colonial story. So they buried the observation, called it a coincidence, and moved on. More heads kept coming out of the ground. La Venta, San Lorenzo, Tres Zapotes, Laguna de los Cerros. By the time archaeologists had cataloged them, 17 massive stone portraits sat in Mexican museums, staring at the world with faces that nobody could explain without sweating. Look at the features and stop letting somebody tell you what your own eyes are seeing. Broad, flat noses with wide nostrils, full, thick lips, rounded cheeks, heavy brow, helmets carved with what looked like braided or corn-rolled hair patterns underneath. Some heads show pierced ears. Some show jaw structures that match West African populations more closely than indigenous Mesoamerican ones. The standard explanation says these are just stylized portraits of Olmec rulers, and the features are coincidental. Hold that explanation up to the 17 separate sculptures carved over a 1,000-year span by an entire civilization that allegedly never met an African, all just happened to converge on the same African facial features by accident. That is not an explanation. That is a refusal to think. Set the timeline so the conversation has a spine. The Olmec civilization rose around 1500 BC in what is now Veracruz and Tabasco in southern Mexico. They built pyramids before the Maya, organized cities before the Aztecs, developed early writing, advanced calendars, and the rubber ball game that spread across Mesoamerica. They were called the mother culture because every later civilization in the region borrowed from them. The heads were carved from basalt boulders weighing up to 40 tons, quarried from mountains as far as 50 miles away from where they were finally placed. No wheels, no draft animals, yet somehow these stones got moved across rivers and jungle to be sculpted into. Whoever did that work had engineering knowledge, leadership structure, and resources organized at a level that the textbook still cannot fully explain. Now bring in the man who paid for telling this truth. Ivan Van Sertima, a Guyanese historian and Rutgers professor, published a book in 1976 called They Came Before Columbus. He laid out the case that specifically from the Mali Empire and earlier Nubian and Egyptian civilizations made contact with the Americas long before 1492. He pointed to the Olmec Heads. He pointed to traditions in Mesoamerica about dark-skinned visitors arriving by boat. He pointed to plant exchanges between Africa and the Americas that happened earlier than European contact should allow, like cotton varieties and bottle gourds showing up on both sides of the Atlantic in ways that mainstream science still struggles to explain. He pointed to oral histories from the Mali Empire itself, recorded by the Arab historian Al-Umari in the 1300s, where Mansa Musa told the story of his predecessor Abu Bakr II, who set sail across the Atlantic with 2,000 ships around 1311 and never returned. Van Sertima got attacked for the rest of his career. Universities tried to discredit him, yet the heads kept staring back from the museum floor, silent, heavy, African in feature. Walk with me through the resistance, because the pattern tells you everything. Mainstream archaeology insists the Olmec heads are indigenous portraits, and that any African resemblance is in the eye of the beholder. They say the Olmecs were entirely native to the Americas, that there was no transatlantic contact before the Vikings around 1000 AD, and that suggesting otherwise diminishes indigenous achievement. Let's address that last part head on, because it gets used as a shield. Acknowledging that Africans may have visited or influenced early American civilizations does not erase indigenous genius. The Olmecs, the Maya, the Aztecs, the Inca, the Mississippians, all of them built astonishing civilizations on their own foundations. The question is not whether indigenous Americans built their world. They did. The question is whether they were the only ones who ever crossed an ocean before 1492. The evidence says no, and the heads are part of that evidence. Look at the technology of the crossing, because the standard objection is always that Africans couldn't have sailed that far. Tell that to the currents. The Atlantic Equatorial Current runs directly from West Africa to the Caribbean and the coast of Brazil and Mexico. A boat that leaves Senegal or Mali's coast and gets pushed off course rides that current straight into the New World. It's not a theory, it's ocean physics. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer, proved it in 1969 and 1970 with his raw expeditions, when he built reed boats based on ancient African and Egyptian designs and sailed them across the Atlantic from Morocco to Barbados. He made it with ancient technology. The crossing was possible. The crossing was likely. The crossing probably happened multiple times across centuries. And every time someone made it, they left fingerprints. Some of those fingerprints became the Olmec heads. Sit with the Mali Empire piece, because Black Americans need to hear this one carefully. In the 1300s, Mansa Musa told an Egyptian official a story about his predecessor. The man before him on the throne, his older brother often identified as Abu Bakr II, didn't believe that the Atlantic Ocean had a far edge. He sent 200 ships out to find it. Only one came back, with a captain saying the rest had vanished into a current that pulled them under. So Abu Bakr II outfitted 2,000 more ships, loaded them with provisions, and sailed out himself around 1311 to see what was on the other side. He never returned. Standard history says he drowned. Some scholars, including Van Sertima, argue he made landfall in the Americas and his people settled. The timing fits. The currents fit. The cultural exchanges some researchers have noted in southern Mexico fit, whether you accept that specific voyage or not. The willingness of a Malian emperor to launch 2,000 ships into the Atlantic in 1311 tells you something the textbook hides. African empires had the resources, the curiosity, and the maritime capability to attempt transatlantic exploration 200 years before Columbus was born. Now look at what other evidence backs the heads up, because no one piece tells the whole story. Skeletal remains in pre-Columbian sites in Mexico, Peru, and Brazil have shown features consistent with African populations in studies that mainstream archaeology has either ignored or contested. Plants like the bottle gourd and certain peanut varieties appear on both continents in time frames that pure ocean drift can't fully explain. Pyramid building shows up in Egypt, Sudan, and Mesoamerica with structural similarities that pure coincidence struggles to cover. Sun worship, mummification practices in some Andean cultures, and shared mythological figures of dark-skinned culture heroes who arrive by boat appear in oral traditions from Mexico down to South America. Take any one of these and the standard response is coincidence. Take all of them together and coincidence starts to look like denial wearing a lab coat. Pause on the heads themselves because the artistry alone deserves its own moment. The largest, called Monument 1, at Venta, stands nearly 9 feet tall. The basalt was quarried at the Tuxtla Mountains and somehow transported overland and across rivers to its final resting place. The sculptors worked without iron tools. They used stone on stone, abrasives, water, and patience measured in years. The level of portraiture suggests these were specific individuals, not generic figures. Each head has different features, different headgear, different ear ornaments. That specificity is what makes the African resemblance so hard to dismiss. If these were stylized symbols, you might explain away the features as artistic convention. But they are portraits of real people whose faces the sculptors saw with their own eyes. And the faces they saw by the sculptor's own hands look like West Africans. Here's where the rage settles into something useful. The reason this conversation gets shut down so fast in academic spaces isn't that the evidence is weak. The evidence is strong enough to warrant serious investigation. The reason is political. The entire colonial project of the Americas rests on the story that Europeans were the first outsiders to find the so-called New World. If Africans got there first, the moral architecture of conquest collapses. The doctrine of discovery, the legal framework the Catholic Church used to justify European colonization in the 1400s, only works if no one else had been there. If a black emperor's fleet touched ground in Brazil or Mexico in the 1300s, then 1492 is not a discovery, but an invasion of a place that had already been visited, traded with, and possibly settled by people the colonizers were simultaneously enslaving back across the Atlantic. The history threatens the legend, so the history gets buried. Take it personal for a second, because that's the only way this knowledge survives. If you're black and watching this in America, you've been taught that your ancestors arrived in this hemisphere in chains. That story is true for the millions who came through the Middle Passage starting in the 1500s. But it is not the whole story of black presence in the Americas. Your ancestors may have been here as free explorers, traders, and settlers long before any slave ship docked. The Olmec Heads are saying that out loud in stone. Other black faces appear in pre-Columbian art across Mexico, Central America, and South America. Carved figures, painted murals, ceramic figurines with African features. These artifacts sit in museums labeled with the safest possible captions, while the obvious conclusion gets whispered about in academic conferences and dismissed before anyone can publish a paper that would change a textbook. Look at the modern resistance, because the gatekeeping is still active. When researchers today try to do DNA analysis on pre-Columbian, remains to check for African genetic markers. Access often gets restricted. When art historians publish papers pointing out African features in Mesoamerican sculpture, journals reject them or bury them. When professors teach the Van Sertima thesis seriously, careers stall. The pattern is consistent enough to be its own data point, a theory that should be testable through standard archaeological and genetic methods keeps running into walls that aren't built out of evidence. They're built out of institutional fear. Because if the theory is right, the textbook industry, the museum industry, the academic prestige economy all have to rewrite their inventories. Easier to call it pseudoscience and keep the shelves the way they are. Stand in front of the heads for a minute in your mind, because the experience itself is the argument. They sit in the Anthropology Museum in Xalapa, in the Park Museum of La Venta in Villahermosa, in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. Tourists walk past them every day. Most of them don't stop long enough to notice what they're looking at. The faces are right there. Wide noses, full lips, braided helmets, African in every feature your grandmother would recognize. If you ever travel to Mexico, go see them in person. Don't take anybody's word for it. Stand at eye level and let the basalt speak. Whatever theory you walk in with, you walk out with a question that the official caption underneath the sculpture cannot answer. Bring this back to what it means right now, because ancient stone doesn't change anything unless living people pick it up. The Olmec Heads matter because they break the lie that black history in the Americas starts in 1619 or 1525 or any other date tied to the slave trade. Black presence in this hemisphere is older than that, possibly thousands of years older. That changes how black children stand on this land. It changes how black families talk about ancestors. It changes how black communities relate to indigenous communities, because the relationship may not have started with shared suffering under European colonization. It may have started with trade, exchange, and possibly intermarriage centuries before the Europeans showed up to break everything. That deeper history is the foundation. Build on it. Now bring the receipts to the dinner table where they belong. Tell your nephew about the Olmec Heads next time he comes over for ribs. Show him a picture on your phone. Ask him what he sees. Watch his face change. Tell your church book club to read They Came Before Columbus. Watch the conversation get loud. Take your grandkid to a museum if there's a Mesoamerican collection nearby, and walk them through the African features in the artwork. Don't lecture, just point and let them look. Children see what adults have been trained to ignore. The truth survives in those moments. In a kid pointing at a stone face and saying that looks like Uncle Marvin. Because it does. Because it should. because somebody who looked like Uncle Marvin carved that face 3,000 years ago in a place the textbook said his people had never been. Drop a comment with the first thing you noticed when you saw an Olmec head. Tell me if you grew up hearing about Africans in the Americas before Columbus, or if today is the first time. If you've been to Mexico and seen the heads in person, say what it felt like. If somebody in your family has been saying this for years and getting laughed at, tag them and let them feel seen. And if you want me to go deeper on Abu Bakr II's voyage, the Mali Empire's maritime history, or the other pre-Columbian artifacts that show African presence in the Americas, tell me which one and I'll bring the receipts the same way.